For everyone who's here, we've finished a study, and now we're going to go into the Old Testament. But before we go into the Old Testament, I wanted to stop and do something really off the beaten path. If you've ever sat in a Bible class like this, I would actually appreciate knowing if you've ever heard this before. I did this with all of our young men, and all of our young men really appreciated it. They liked knowing about it. They liked learning about it. This is logical fallacies. And what we're going to do, it's going to be a fast class. It'll only take us a couple or three times. If you are visiting and you don't care for it, that's fine. If you're visiting and you do care for it, it's getting recorded. So however long it takes us, 2 or 3 more or so, then you'll have it to be able to see it on the website, on our YouTube channel. But to me, it's necessary, especially if you're someone who's going to talk to people about the Bible, because you're able to see logical fallacies that are being used, and just as importantly, you're going to hopefully get them identified when you use them. Because in the end, all we want to do is to convert people to what? To Christ. Convert them to truth, and not have that truth be in any way manipulated. And that's essentially what logical fallacies do. It manipulates people, and it can skew the truth. We don't want to do that, so just this very short little period of study, and then we'll move on back into the Old Testament. So before we get started, we'll go to Acts chapter 17 first, just to show this real quick. To set this stage, does anyone remember what rationalism is? It was a term that was used as far as the understanding of the world back in the 1800s. It might have come into the 1900s, but it was a term back a couple of hundred years ago called rationalism. Do you have any idea what that would have meant? Rationalism. Everything in the universe must be explained in a what? In a rational way. And in short, saying that everything is explained in a rational way takes away everything that's supernatural. So therefore, rationalism was an ingenious way to say what about the Bible? It's false. Ultimately, that was the end result. That was a unique way to say that it's false. Maybe now we might know it more as naturalism, meaning that the universe has evolved in a very naturalistic, uniformitarian way. But a couple of hundred years ago, it was rationalism. And if miracles aren't rational, then they can't be real. And if miracles can't be real, then let's face it, the Bible is just pretty much false. There is a line, and I've got a lesson kind of in the thought process of eventually approaching this. There is a line that all of us face between emotionalism and rationalism. Emotionalism in the sense that when we worship God, there's got to be an emotional component to it, or else everything that we do is dry and without spirit. We'll talk a little bit about that tonight. Tonight's just going to be a really basic lesson on what our worship is. But there's also a rationalistic component to it, meaning that it's reasoned, it's tempered. I can go to Scripture and I can do what with it? I can study it, I can prove it, I can show it. It's rational. And there's some religious groups who have kind of gotten so far askew that they have kind of removed all of the emotion from it. It is just more of a dry thing to behold. On the other hand, there's some groups that have gone so far to the emotional side of it They've let the level or the intensity of emotion define what? Their truth and how well they're going to adhere to truth. Now, the point at some point is actually here in between. And this is actually one of the logical fallacies that we'll talk about. Not this morning, but we'll talk about it later on. Acts chapter 17, verse 2. What does it say? Acts chapter 17, verse 2. Okay. So what does reasoning mean? What does it being logical mean? It means something that you can understand. Yeah, absolutely. And here's the New Testament portraying Paul doing what? Reasoning. It also happens in Acts chapter 18, verse 4. It's the same thing. It occurs in Acts chapter 24 and verses 24 and 25. The truth is something that is logical and it's something that's reasonable. In the Old Testament, one of the most famous passages of the Old Testament is, "Come, let us" what? Reason together. Come, let us reason together. So the gospel demands thinking. The gospel demands thinking, which actually runs completely counter to what a lot of people would say. I'm going to mess this up. I think it was Karl Marx or Jung who described religion as the opiate of the masses. I can't remember who it actually was, which meant that in order for you to be a Christian, you've got to check all of that reasoning and logical ability at the door. But the fact is, the Bible actually is built on reasoning. It's built on logic. Hence the reason why we need to actually study what these logical fallacies are, to make sure that, again, as we present truth, we present it correctly, and then as we discuss truth with others, that we're not having it presented to us in an illogical way. Again, ultimately for the end of making sure that truth is presented. So, this is just going to be a whole big list of us going through these logical fallacies. Some of these you've never heard of. Most of these you're going to be really familiar with. You just didn't know what they were. So we're going to begin with, I think, a pretty famous one, and that's the straw man fallacy. The straw man fallacy is that you misrepresent someone's argument to make it easier to attack. So you exaggerate something and you misrepresent something because when you set up the straw man, which really isn't real, and then you attack it, what have you done? If you set up something that basically doesn't exist and attack it, what have you done? In a way, you've kind of been dishonest. The whole idea of the straw man undermines rationalism, the idea of a rational discourse, but it also harms your own position. Because if someone sees that you're not going to be honest with what they say, then what are they going to assume about you? You're not going to be honest either. Maybe one of the good ways to do this is to give you an example, and I will have an example of these with every single one of these, because sometimes the example is a whole lot easier to see than the actual description of it, and I understand that. So an example. After Will said that we should put more money into health and education, Warren responded by saying that he was surprised that Will hates our country so much that he wants to leave it defenseless by cutting military spending. Now, did you see the straw man that was set up? Let me repeat it again. After Will said that we should put more money into health and education, Warren responded by saying he was surprised that Will hates our country so much that he wants to leave it defenseless by cutting military spending. So the straw man is set up that he hates our country so much to leave it defenseless, and then he attacks that, not the real issue at hand. I think a lot of preachers go back and really, really serious Bible students go back and they read debates. A lot. I mean, I don't know how many, and I hope this is something that continues in the younger generations, but I don't know how many people that I've come across who are avid readers of debates. And in the debates, you'll see straw men being set up, something that's set up and then attacked when it isn't really the issue at all. These all happen in religion, but mostly you're going to get these examples where? In what? In politics. In politics. I would be shocked if you hadn't, by the time we finish this in a couple of times, I'd be shocked if you hadn't heard of every single one of these used in politics. Have you ever heard of this one used in politics? Yeah, all of the time. So the straw men set up, and I can remember just in years past, if one group wants to cut something like Medicare, then the other group would say that, well, apparently they want older people eating dog food because they can't afford their medicine. So that's a straw man argument. It doesn't actually address how to work out the issue. It creates this false issue, and then it goes off after that. It can happen. It happens all of the time. False cause. False cause. You presume that a real or a perceived relationship between something means that one is the cause of the other. So false cause. There's a couple of different directions that this can go in. This isn't just one single thing. It can actually usually break down into two. Someone can presume that because things are happening together, one thing is the cause of the other. Okay? So because things happen together, one is the cause of the other. You ignore the possibility that there might be a common cause to both of them. So the idea that two things happen together, the other idea is that you have a cause where you assume one thing happens before it, then both of them are caused together. Okay, so that sets it up. Now let me give you an example. An example would be something like this. Pointing to a fancy chart, Roger shows how temperatures have been rising over the past few centuries, while at the same time, the number of pirates have been decreasing. So pirates cool the earth, and global warming is a hoax. Okay, let me go through that again. Pointing to a fancy chart, Roger shows how temperatures have been rising over the past few centuries, while at the same time the number of pirates have been decreasing. Thus, pirates cool the earth and global warming is a hoax. Do you see the false cause? Okay. You see the false cause that's put together because they both happen together or they both happen separately, that one must be the cause of the other. Again, it happens to as far as occurring in religious discussions as well, the element of false cause. This next one happens a lot, an appeal to emotion. So what do you think an appeal to emotion is? You use an emotional response as a what? As a valid reason for something. Using an emotional response for a valid reason for something. Now, appeals to emotion include appeals to fear, envy, hatred, pity, pride, and more. And I want to make the point that sometimes when you appeal to emotion, it's actually what? If I'm going to appeal, for example, to fear, envy, hatred, pity, pride, and more, sometimes those appeals are actually good ones. Sometimes they're good ones. You appeal necessarily to bad emotions because you want to do what with them? You want to change them. You want to subdue them. Sometimes you appeal to good emotions because you and the converse want to do what? You want to make those flourish. You want to make those abound. But sometimes this is done to obscure the fact that in biblical text, there is no compelling rational reason to exist for the actual position, because it's been an appeal to emotion. Ultimately, it's just a dishonest thing. Now, let me give you an example. Luke didn't want to eat his sheep brains and chopped liver and Brussels sprouts, but his father told him to think about the poor, starving children in a third world country who weren't fortunate enough to have any food at all. That's an appeal to emotion. Now, how many of you have used that before on your kids? That's an appeal to emotion. Now, sometimes, again, appeals to emotion aren't always bad, but sometimes they twist truth. So how might an appeal to emotion be used maybe in a wrong way biblically? Yeah, that's been a common one. You know, every congregation just about in some way, shape, or form struggles with issues relating to divorce and remarriage. Now, why is that? Why do they struggle with issues about divorce and remarriage? Let me ask you a more pointed question. Is it because we've got a problem with the text? Not really. It's more a problem with what? It's more a problem with the personalities that are involved. Marital issues are, and I'll just say this and leave it at that. But once you actually dive in to it neck deep with both people, you will find that marital issues are notoriously complex. Very, very hard to understand and get a grasp on. And because they can be so complicated, there's an appeal to emotion that kind of leaves people maybe not as responsible to the Word of God. And it's really, really easy to do this. And again, we've probably all been worked on by this one over a period of time. It's an appeal to emotion. Sometimes appealing to emotion is okay, it's good, it's just. But if the appeal to emotion is there, if it exists to try to manipulate us around biblical truth, then we can't what? We can't do that. Yeah, we can't do that. You could look at, there's lots of arguments to be made about how the church uses its money and the emotional appeal. I had brought up in the lesson, there's lots of people who would say that the one of the reasons why we can't convert people is because we don't have a band. I'll talk a little bit about that tonight. We don't have a band. And unless you have a band, you're just dead in the water. That's an appeal to what? That's an appeal to emotion. Well, no church wants to die, I don't suspect. So I got to make a change. No, it's a way to subvert around biblical truth. An appeal to emotion. Again, it's a big one. Okay, the fallacy. The fallacy. So, presuming that because a claim has been poorly argued or that a fallacy has been made, that it's necessarily wrong. So something about reading debates or watching debates, even presidential debates, clearly sometimes they're really, really good at it, and clearly sometimes they're what? They're very bad at it. I've had the opportunity to actually go and sit and listen to a few debates in my life. Some people are outstanding at it. and some people just aren't. I mean, some people struggle with it, and I would cut someone a lot of slack because you understand the importance involved. You sometimes know, sometimes you don't know what the other person is going to argue. So those things have to be assembled quickly. Your thoughts have to be assembled quickly before it's time for you to stand right back up and then give some kind of presentation that answers what has just been mentioned. All the while doing this in a clear, coherent way, knowing what's at stake. It's a lot of pressure. Some people are excellent at it. Some people just aren't. So in thinking about more about the fact about they're not, we have to be mindful of the fact that just because someone doesn't argue it well doesn't mean what? Doesn't mean that it's wrong. And here's again, these are cute little examples, but recognizing that Amanda had committed a fallacy in arguing that we should eat healthy food because it was popular, Alice resolved to eat bacon double cheeseburgers every day. Two friends get into a fight, and just because one of them can't argue very well, the other one goes ahead and just takes the opposite position or the opposite extreme. Have you ever had this one, the fallacy used on you? I have. Yeah, I have quite a bit, actually, when you sit down and study with people, particularly people who are extremely well-versed in their own specific points of view. They are very, very good at it. So they'll bring up the fallacy. If you make a mistake in the reasoning, then you must be able to throw it out completely. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Okay, slippery slope. Anyone ever heard of slippery slope? Who's heard of slippery slope? Yeah, everyone's heard of slippery slope. So, slippery slope, you make out like if we allow A to happen, then Z will eventually happen too. Therefore, A should not happen. So the problem with the slippery slope is that it avoids engaging with the issue at hand and goes toward a hypothetical. Sometimes the hypothetical is very, very extreme, but it nevertheless goes to a hypothetical. Now, this is a logical fallacy, but I want to bring up the fact that sometimes logical fallacies exist because there has indeed been a sense of truth. Meaning that sometimes if I don't argue against something, if I don't stop something, then what will happen? Something worse. Something worse. So let me give you an example about this. And this is not that ridiculous because I literally heard this, not from a pulpit, but I literally heard this in the discussion, in the debate, our own societal debate, not 12 years ago, I think. Let me give you the example. Colin asserts that if we allow same-sex couples to marry, then the next thing we know, we'll be allowing people to marry their parents, cars, and even monkeys. So that's the slippery slope, taken to a pretty wild extreme, but that's the slippery slope. And I promise you, I heard someone on national television arguing this. What's wrong with the slippery slope? It can go off the deep end. Because honestly, you know, the fact of people marry their parents, cars, and even monkeys is pretty what? Is pretty silly. Does it happen? Does it happen? Someone tell me yes or no. Does it happen? Actually, it does. Actually, it does. We would call them statistical outliers, meaning that, does it happen? Yes. How often does it happen? It's unbelievably rare, because usually when someone gets to that point, they're either just doing it to make a point, or let's face it, what's the other alternative? They're probably mentally ill, and I say that with all respectfulness. But the slippery slope it doesn't deal with the actual issue. The actual issue at hand in my little illustration is whether or not a man can marry a man and a woman can marry a woman. So the Bible speaks to that. I don't have to create a slippery slope, but I said that someone invented the whole idea of a slippery slope fallacy because they could see that sometimes this does indeed do what? This does indeed happen. If I take a young boy and a young girl that are 14 years old and they just started dating and they start doing things, there can be a slippery slope. And where does that slippery slope end up? We're all adults here. Where can the slippery slope end up? Premarital sex with fornication and ending up being pregnant. Is that an outlier? No, no, it's not. What's the recent numbers of high school students who commit fornication before they're married? Pretty high. I think the last I saw it was around 50%, I think, 40 or 50%. So, if I paint a slippery slope, it's not like it's just an impossible, outrageous hypothetical. Sometimes it is. My little example is an outrageous hypothetical. But sometimes it's not. I mean, someone created this because of some reason. But the point is, let's get to what? Let's get to divine biblical truth. Keep the argument with the divine biblical truth because that's what's the most important. Okay. Did someone have their hand raised? By the way, I'm not great at seeing hand raises, but did someone want to say something about this? Okay, next up. This one's a very popular one. Ad hominem. Ad hominem. So you attack your opponent's character or their personal traits instead of actually engaging in the argument. Have you ever heard this happen? All of the time. It takes the form of sometimes an overt attack, sometimes it's a very subtle one, but the desired effect is that you undermine them without ever doing what? Dealing with the issue. This one is just brilliant because you're able to undermine someone without actually ever dealing with the issue. This ad hominem one can be dealt with, can be used in again, lots of times in religious debates. I've seen this ad hominem attack. So let me give you an example of it. So after Sally presents an eloquent and compelling case for more equitable taxation, Sam asks the audience whether we should believe anything from a woman who isn't married and was once arrested. Okay, so do you see what happened? The attack was on the what? Was on the person, not on the what? Not on the issue of fair and equitable taxing. So have you ever seen an ad hominem attack? Okay, what have some of your examples been? Okay, Connie?
they didn't even address the fact that I said this is the worst sheetrock job I've ever seen. They just started attacking his character, and but their attack was useless because all this stuff that they thought he was making up a bunch of stuff, and he wasn't. It was actually truthful stuff. How could he do this construction when he's been in the Army this long? And I said, well, have you ever heard of the National Guard? They don't do it full time, but still, that was their ad hominem attack on him.
I was wondering when you first started talking about that, and I've got to repeat some of it for the camera, but the idea of having a construction job and then saying that the sheetrock was subpar, you know what I was expecting you to say is that they were complaining about the fact that you were a woman complaining about the work instead of a man. You know, let me talk to your husband. We'll deal with it, because that's all over the place.
Car repairs, but it did happen with this situation. And this situation with us became a hundreds of thousands of dollars lawsuit because of the work that was done, the subpar quality of it, and the damage that they had done at another job. And the only thing that kept me engaged with this argument was the fact that I did have a young man working with me that his job was to keep me safe. And so he was standing in the background just listening because he was my assistant, basically. And it was it was the angriest I have ever been, I believe. And it wasn't at them for the bad sheetrock. It was at them for
The attack, the ad hominem attack, yeah. Is it okay, babe? Yeah. That's what I was going to bring up, and I've not been paid in any way to say this, although I wouldn't be opposed to it. But one of the reasons why the young men, I think, enjoyed going through this is because some of these are used on them, and I think ad hominem is number one. When we have a young man who's unmarried and doesn't have children stand up in front of you, what is the two things that he cannot preach about? Marriage and children. And brethren, I'm going to tell you, behind the scenes, I had every one of those young men who would say, I really want to speak about this. I feel like it's important. I feel like I've got something to say, or it's necessary for me to start learning how to do this, but I'm so afraid of what? Of people criticizing me. Now, they're not going to criticize the biblical truth. What are they going to criticize? Him. And yes, maybe they are going to say something completely dumb, but it was my job to deal with that. That was my job. If they said something erroneous or dumb, I fixed that. But that is an ad hominem attack. Those young men have just as much right to stand up and present that level of biblical truth, no matter how dumb it comes out saying to you. They have that right to try to do their very best to address it. And yes, as they get older and as they experience more things, their points of view will change. I promise that. But they can still understand and present biblical truth. And that's an ad hominem attack. And and I've talked to men who are older than I am, who are gospel preachers, and they never got married. I mean, never met the person, never met the right person. And even they've admitted at ages, older than I am, that reluctance to be able to address that, not because they can't understand truth or that they don't think that they have something useful to say, but because they fear the repercussions of trying to stand up and do something that they haven't experienced, the blowback, and that's an ad hominem attack. Carla? Yes, the Wednesday night invitations where these young men get up and they talk about these things. Again, many of them with very, very limited life experience, but they do it, and we're appreciative of it. Okay. This one's odd, and even it's odd, but you're going to immediately recognize it, and I've got to try to pronounce it correctly. Tu quoque, which is Latin for you too. Tu quoque avoids having to engage with criticism by turning it back on the accuser. You answer criticism with criticism. There is a debater out there, he's still alive, who was an absolute master at this. But it's a logical fallacy. Considered to be a logical fallacy. This fallacy is commonly employed as an effective red herring. What is the term red herring? It's some kind of false truth that you chase after. I was hoping everyone would know what a red herring was. Jenny and I I felt so old. Jenny and I had a Bible study with a young couple last week or a week before, and we were talking about civic clubs. Lions Club, Rotary Club, Kiwanis Club. What do? I don't know, but I know they existed. We bring them up, complete blank stare. This young couple in their 20s, no idea any of these existed. I dated myself. So I was hoping when I brought up red herring that you guys would still know what a red herring was. That's what this is, basically. You take the heat off the accused by turning it back on yourself, because the implication is if you both do the same thing, then you're both hypocrites, and it basically negates the whole issue that you have between you. Let me give you an example. Alice identified that Susie had committed a logical fallacy. But instead of addressing the substance of her claim, Susie accused Alice of committing a fallacy earlier on in the conversation. So they equal one another out. Maybe using a different term. If I bring up the fact, and I have to watch myself because even there are times when I'm tempted to do it and I don't even realize it. But someone tells us that we are judging people. Okay, you judge too much. Well, the natural response would be that if you've judged that about me, guess what you're doing? You're judging. Tu quoque, you too. You take the complaint and you turn it back on someone else. Again, I've seen people who are just masterful at this, but it's a logical fallacy. Again, you deal with the fact, if we're talking about judging in the religious realm, you tell people how we judge and why we judge and what's right to judge and what's improper to judge. That's the true biblical issue, and that's what we need to deal with first and foremost, not turning it back on one another. Okay, we've got several more to go, but I think that maybe we'll finish these up next time.